Welcome everybody to the October 2025 webinar in our UK Freshwater Quality Research Programme series. Just as a note for those of you who are not aware, we've currently got 5 large projects within the programme, all tackling sort of different angles on UK freshwater quality, and the programme is overseen by a sort of champion team, of which I'm representing the team today along with Finn. So if we have next slide, please, Finn. So just to note that we have a sort of annual cycle of these webinars where we have guest speakers, but we also have updates from the projects themselves. And as we move into sort of early 2026, we'll have a sort of set of updates from those five projects as well, just to give you that sort of annual update about where they're at and progress as new findings and new outputs are made. But an invitation to you all as well, if you've got something you'd like to present, be it research, be it policy related, be it practical related, then feel free to contact the team and we'll see if we can create a slot for you. And it doesn't have to be a full hour slot. We can do slots where we have shorter presentations as well in groups and things like that. So it's up to you, but do get in touch. And a little bit of information about the program, of course, via our webpage, and there's QR codes that take you to different places, including some of the biosecurity training that's been supporting the program as well. A note for those of you who are not aware, earlier this week, a new research funding call has been announced as part of the programme. So this focuses on the catchments around Loch Ness in Northern Ireland, and in particular looks at microbial source tracking to understand that system better in terms of pathways for pollutants and so on. So please do check out that funding call. The funding source is coming from partly from Natural Environment Research Council and partly from DEFRA in Northern Ireland, and that funding has come through to us, and then we're administering it on behalf of the programme. So it's not a UKRI sort of application form that you have to fill in. It's actually coming through the University of Leeds in a slightly different process. So any questions, of course, contact us about that as well. But just to note that that call is live for any eligible institutes that are UKRI funding eligible. Next slide, please, Finn. So that's a little introduction from me. Really pleased to welcome Julia Knapp today from Durham University, who is going to tell us a bit about her work on river water quality and how that's shaped by land-river connectivity in a changing climate, a subject very close to my heart. So really pleased to welcome you, Julia, and happy to hand over to you now. Just a reminder to you all, please put questions as we go along in the Q&A, not the chat. And then the point about joining live is that we'll stop the recording at the end of the presentation, but then we'll go into the Q&A, which will be kind of free and frank and not recorded. So that's the benefit of joining live for those of you who are here today. So over to you, Julia.
Thank you very much. I will try to share my screen, and actually here's the. I hope you can see the presentation. Thank you very much for the invitation, and I'm really happy about the opportunity to talk about the paper. This paper is a review paper that was actually led by Professor Lee from Penn State University in the US, and that we collaborated on about 2 years ago at this point, where we wanted to bring together all the evidence, the scientific evidence that there is on how climate change impacts river water quality. And I'll talk you through this paper and our main findings a little bit, but I'll also talk about generally river water quality in the context of climate change and what we mean by this land-river connectivity, because that's a key element that I'll get back to later on. And I think, so taking a step back and not focusing on water quality, but water quantity, we know that there are huge impacts of climate change. And because we're not in the US, I can still say climate change. And I think the data is quite evident and quite obvious that we are seeing this huge change in climate, in temperatures particular. And that is impacting water quantity to a large extent. And we see this in the newspaper every other week, where we see, for example, more droughts. So we have a higher intensity or a severity of droughts and a higher frequency of droughts. This is a picture from the Loire Valley in France from a few summers ago. The Loire is a very big river there. It was basically, it just dried up to be these small pools of water that were mostly stagnant. And there's also lots of scientific data, of course, showing that we are having more droughts and more frequent droughts. So this data set shows the frequency of drought days under different climate change projections. We used to say that RCP 8.5, so the one on the right-hand side, is the worst case scenario. We are actually now on track to meeting this, and this may soon be our best case scenario. But if you look at the panel 31, you can see the changes in expected for Europe, and we can see that the frequency of drought days will increase substantially with climate change. We also know that climate change triggers more frequent and more severe floods. So again, a picture, I think this is also from a few years ago when I made a first presentation on this paper, and we were talking about this, like putting this paper together. And there's lots of data obviously showing this as well, that because of climate change, we have more record-breaking precipitation events, and those large precipitation events obviously result in floods, or can result in floods. So all of this is increasing because of climate change. We also have, due to climate change, we have sea level rise because ice caps are melting, but also because of and that in combination with the flood events is resulting in just more and more coastal flooding. So looking on the graph on the right-hand side, that's again that's the expected flooding days per year in Los Angeles, based depending on different types of sea level rise scenarios, so different climate change scenarios. And in this worst case scenario that's used here, we'd actually from 2075 onwards, Los Angeles is expected to see coastal flooding every single day of the year. So I think that shows the magnitude of all of this. But I'm sure everyone in this webinar knows about the climate change impacts on water quantity. What is much less talked about is the impact of of climate change on water quality. And right about the time when so the authors and we first started discussing this topic, there was a big a mass die-off of fish in the Oder River, which is the river that's between Germany and Poland. And it wasn't very clear what was actually causing this mass die-off of fish. Initially, they thought it was a pollution incident, and then further investigation said, oh, well, it's probably not a pollution incident, it's too localized. And so if you look in the different newspaper articles on the right-hand side, you can see there's things like mysterious mass fish kill, or fish die-off remains a mystery. And it's basically, for a long time, it wasn't really clear. And I think it's still not fully clear what caused this huge die-off of fish. And later on, so there were quite a few studies done on this in the end. And I think the final conclusions were that due to climate change and due to other smaller pollution events, these fish were severely stressed, and then a small incident actually triggered this massive die-off. So it was a very complex interaction of different effects that had to do with climate change, but not just climate change. And this is what's kind of making this whole thing so difficult. This is why people aren't really looking at water quality in the context of climate change so much, because it is really it's kind of invisible, and it's very complex. So for example, back then we looked at the IPCC 6th assessment report from 2022, the one that was on impact, adaptation, and vulnerability. And what we saw is the report is about 3,000 pages long, and if the words flood and drought were mentioned roughly on every page of that report on average, but water quality was mentioned only on every 10th page. So it's not just in the news that water quality in the context of climate change has received limited attention, but also in the scientific world, because the IPCC reports are made by groups of scientists, and they reflect the scientific status quo, or the scientific knowledge that we have at the time. So this is why I think we ended up writing this paper, because we were hoping that this topic would gain a little bit more attention. And as the invitation to this webinar actually shows, that it is working. And so I think we're seeing a lot more in terms of water quality considerations in the context of climate change. But so just a little bit of it, that was just a brief history of how we actually got to this paper, but I'll take a step back and talk about water quality first of all, what it actually is, how we define it and why it's important. And then I'll talk about how climate change may impact water quality, so the stuff that we put in this paper and that you can read up on if you want to, but I'll give you a brief an overview of what we found and what we compiled. So this was not a study that we did ourselves, but it was basically compiling all the evidence that already exists and trying to bring that into a coherent framework. And of course, we also gave some recommendations on how to address these challenges and how to go forward. And so in terms of water quality, we all know, I think we all have a general understanding that water quality is important. This has always also been recognized by the UN in terms of the Sustainable Development Goals. So the goal number 6 is on clean water and sanitation. So the clean water includes things like drinking water quality, but it also reflects ecosystem health. And when I talk about water quality, we have to be very careful with the definition. There is no absolute definition of water quality, because water quality always depends on the intended use of water. So for example, if you have 2 glasses of water, one is tap water and one is seawater, of course you will tell me that you can't drink seawater, but likewise, a marine animal cannot survive in tap water because it requires a saline environment. So hence, these 2 different types of waters may both have good water quality, but that water quality is in relation to the use of the water as drinking water or as an aquatic habitat for marine animals, for example. And that's why we have tons of different water quality regulations, and some of you may probably know one or the other better than the other ones, but so we've got drinking water regulations that set the standard for drinking water quality and tell us or make sure that the water that we get from the tap is drinkable and doesn't damage our health. But there's also wastewater directives that relate to the water that's being emitted into the rivers or and the environment. We have the Water Framework Directive then that actually looks at the status of water bodies, so lakes, rivers, groundwater, and makes sure that these are evaluates their quality in relation to standards that are good for ecological for the ecological habitat. We also have bathing water directives that set standards for the quality of water that's designed for bathing. So it's always about the intended use of the water, and I think that's very, very important to keep in mind when we talk about water quality. There's not a good or bad per se, but it's always depending on the quality. And from a scientific point of view, we also don't just talk about water in its intended use. We talk about water quality often simply as the chemical composition of this water. And whether that's good or bad isn't so much of the focus, it's more of how it's changing because of different alterations, for example, because of climate change. So why we care about water quality, first of all, we know we only have very limited amounts of water or usable water. We've got a lot of water on the planet, but most of that is in the oceans, and we can't use that for drinking water purposes or irrigation. Then there's only a very limited amount of fresh water, and those are usually stored. This fresh water is mostly stored in glaciers and ice caps. So very little of the water on this planet is actually available for us as humans, which is the groundwater, and some water in the lakes and in the rivers. But apart from this whole drinking water and irrigation, we also need water quality for economic deteriorating water quality has impacts on economy and on the society. So for example, if we irrigate our fields, our crops with saline or poor quality waters, that can result in the degradation of soils, and then in consequence, the soils can't produce as much crops anymore or sustain them. We also need a lot of water, and we need a lot of cold water to cool thermoelectric plants, and that wasn't really the case. Because of generative AI at the moment, we have huge servers that need to be cooled. That wasn't so much of an issue when we looked at this in 2022, 23, but now this has definitely changed. So in the summers, that can become problematic, because if we've got low flows because of droughts, and the water is also quite warm, we can't use that water anymore to cool down the power plants. And the consequences of that could be disastrous, or at least it's very expensive to use that fine water that we can use for these purposes. And of course, we've got great technology, but to clean water and make it available for humans. But the more degraded the water is that we start with in the treatment process, the more expensive and it will be to obtain clean and usable drinking water. And of course, in other places, they're not as lucky as us, where that technology is simply not available. So basically, it's not just about having clean water to drink, but it's also has kind of wide-reaching implications if water quality deteriorates. So for agriculture industry and of course the domestic water use as well. And last but not least, having clean water in our environment is a good indicator of the health of the environment. So rivers usually work integrate all the water from a catchment, from the landscape. So that tells us something about how healthy that landscape is in some ways. And that's why it's important to monitor water quality in rivers as well. So this is just a summary slide of why water is important, but I'm sure everyone knows that. So now I want to talk a few minutes about this called land-river connectivity that we have in the title of this paper, and that I think is very, very important. So water quality, the water quality of the river is shaped by the pathways that the water takes from the precipitation down to the landscape, through the land itself, and on the way to the rivers. So most of the water that we find in the river didn't fall into the river as precipitation, but it has traveled quite far. And I think the one thing we all know about the stuff that's in the news is that the inputs to the landscape are important in shaping the water quality of the rivers. So we have lots of there's lots of publication on wastewater at the moment in the news. There's a lot about agriculture, nitrate, and all these things. These are important. But it's not the only thing. The other thing that we need to focus on are the pathways of water. So what does the water pick up on its journey through that subsurface? Does it encounter any reactive materials in the bedrock, for example? And because that can result in transformation of certain solutes on its way to the river. And interlinked with this concept of the pathways is the travel time. So how long does the water take to actually move through that subsurface? Because that means if it takes longer, it has more time for reactions to occur. And that can be good or bad, depending on the compounds that we have in the water initially. Because we can get rid of some of those, or we can actually pick up something and or create more toxic byproducts, for example. So this travel time, there have been different types of scientific studies on this, but basically it varies depending on your topography. It varies depending on your on the surface, on the subsurface, on the composition, the bedrock, and so on. So we can look at this, but that's basically just as a side note. So now the main topic of the actual paper was climate change impacts on water quality. One of the things I want to really point out, this is not something we will see in the future. This is something we are already seeing, and there are lots of different changes that are happening. And these changes can be categorized into two different topics. So one of them on the left-hand side are the gradual and persistent changes. So these are these long-term changes or slow changes in water quality due to climate change are happening because of long-term modification of the ecosystem itself and of the subsurface structures. So these are caused by things that have continuous effect on the environment typically. And it's very hard to actually detect them because they're often masked by these short-term variations that are caused by weather variations, basically. That's why we need lots of data and long time series of data to identify these gradual and persistent changes. On the other hand, we have some abrupt changes in water quality that are brought about by these climate extremes like floods and droughts that I already talked about. These extremes induce often short-term changes in the hydrological and the biogeochemical functioning. And then these are very, very noticeable, but sometimes the effects of these extremes go away once the system returns to its previous conditions, but sometimes also, or some of these changes are also long-lasting. So even though the event itself is short, the consequences last for much longer. And I'll go through those two now in a bit more detail to tell you what we mean by this and what the kind of scientific evidence is that we've compiled, and what that kind of what mechanisms this points to. So, I mean, one good example for this kind of persistent and gradual change that also shows the complexity of this whole system of water quality is the temperature effect on oxygen. So, the amount of oxygen we can dissolve in water depends very strongly on the temperature of the water. And at the typical temperatures of lakes and rivers and groundwaters between 10 and 15 degrees, we can dissolve around 12 milligrams per liter. But as temperatures increase in lakes, because of climate change, we can see that these oxygen levels or oxygen concentrations, dissolved oxygen concentrations, are decreasing. And there was a paper published in 2021 that looked at these across temperate lakes and said that actually these oxygen levels during the summers were reaching very low concentrations that were close to hypoxia in some cases, but also so for different aquatic species require different minimum amounts of oxygen, but most of these minimum amounts of oxygen are somewhere between 7, 8 to down to 5 milligrams per liter. So if we have water temperatures around 25 degrees, we get quite close to that. And during a hot summer where water levels are low in lakes, this can actually be reached. And even if we don't reach those toxic levels of low oxygen, even decreased oxygen use results in a severe stress on the ecosystem. So basically, the fishes are stressed and so on. So that's then when we think back to this, the example of the Oder River. Once we have this stressed ecosystem, even small perturbations, small pollution incidents can actually have detrimental consequences for the ecosystem itself. So basically, this kind of shows this example of oxygen, which is quite intuitive, I think, but it still shows how complex the interactions are and how difficult it is to disentangle the various different components that are causing or that are having an impact on water quality. It even gets a bit more complex when we look at flow paths. So climate change is resulting in an alteration of the flow path by simply lowering water tables in landscapes. And if you see the figure on the right at the top, you can see that so basically low flows, most of our streams and most of our rivers are being fed by groundwater. So any solute that is derived from groundwater will have highest concentrations during these low flow conditions. On the other hand, when we have higher water levels, water tables, we are accessing the soils more, and then we are flushing some of those solutes into the river. But as we are decreasing water tables in our catchments, we are changing these flow paths that are predominantly being activated, and thus changing the types of solutes that are being delivered to rivers. We also have, with the lowered water table, we also have more reactions occurring in the shallow subsurface. So when it's dry and warm, we have a lot more biogeochemical processes that occur. So on this figure on the left-hand side, you can see in the arid and warm conditions, catchments function more as a reactor. So we can have an accumulation of different types of compounds that we would normally not have under normal conditions or under pre-climate change conditions. And then when actually, we have these flood events or something, these accumulated solutes can actually be exported. So we have a stronger solute export and stronger solute flushing out of the system once it does wet up. So we've got a change in these kind of solute or reaction processes and changes in pathways. It's also been shown that climate change can actually impact or change bedrock weathering. There are two different ways of doing this. So first of all, we've got, if the water table drops, we've got a deeper penetration of oxygen into the subsurface. And then that means we can oxidate redox-sensitive bedrock material, and this can result in the mobilization of toxic metals like arsenic, for example. On the other hand, of course, if the water table drops, trees still need to somehow access water. So there's some species that are able to increase their rooting depth, but also at the same time, we can see that tree species that have shallow roots are more likely to die, and then they'll get replaced by species with deeper roots. And these basically, and then by extending this kind of the rooting zone deeper, this results in the fracturing of the bedrock. So basically it's modifying the soil properties and also the bedrock actually itself, the bedrock fracturing, and thus changing again the pathways that are available to water to travel through the subsurface. And this happens actually on annual to decadal timescales. There are just some studies that have shown that these changes happen quite rapidly. So basically, when we think about the gradual changes, it's an alteration of flow path and changes solute processing and export, mostly due to lowering of the water table, but also that's causing an increase, an enhanced bedrock weathering. So these are really gradual and persistent, and they are, so basically once you've changed your subsurface once through bedrock weathering, you can't get it back really. It's a continuous and gradual change that stays that way over time. We also have, on the other hand, of course, the abrupt and episodic changes. So these are mostly the destructive events that are very common or that we all know about, so droughts and floods and fires. And these destructive events rapidly change the chemical, the physical, and the biological structure of the land. And it's not just the events themselves, but it's also these rapid transitions between these events. So sometimes we may have a drought that then during the drought, because it's so dry, we have a fire, and then that's followed by a flood. So these kind of transitions between different events have substantial implications for water quality as well. And also these abrupt and episodic events can change flow path and biogeochemical reactions. So while these events are rapid and short, the impacts are often long-lasting. So for example, when we have droughts, we've got often our running rivers will dry up and they will convert to a series of disconnected and stagnant pools, like you can see on the right-hand side, or as I showed you with the picture of the Loire Valley earlier on. So these little ponds and pools of water will be, of course, warmer than typically, and there's no input of fresh material. So you've got a high biogeochemical processing in these pools that then changes the types of solids we have in there, and we can increase the amounts of solids in those pools. And then when at some point this wets up again, we've got a reconnection of these pools and a post-drought flushing of these accumulated solutes can actually have more implications on water quality by causing eutrophication in the river system then. So often we can, or in some ways we can refer to these droughts as hot moments, so very important points of biogeochemical processing and reactions. And in this paper, we also try to bring together what drought causes, or how drought causes the impact of droughts on various different components, so water temperature, dissolved oxygen, nutrients, carbon, and so on. And basically, looking at the literature, it's not super clear. There are, well, of course, water temperature is increased during droughts because it gets warmer, and typically dissolved oxygen concentrations decrease. But there are studies that show the opposite effect for dissolved oxygen. So with these arrows on the right-hand side, we try to indicate what the dominant changes are that are being observed under these conditions. But because we always have a reverse arrow as well, that's often smaller, it's not entirely clear. So it's quite unpredictable, and under slightly different conditions, something slightly different may happen, basically. And that's, yeah, compiling the evidence, that's what's making this whole thing tricky as well. Same thing, so for floods and storms, we've got during floods we can have soil erosion, so high sediment loads, as you can see in the picture. Storms may cause landslides and just general types of sediment flushing. And once we have stagnant water on the land surface, there is also possible spread of waterborne diseases, so impacting human health. And from a catchment mechanistic point of view, floods result in a connection of the upland area, so the landscape, to the river. And if you think about this enhanced processing that we discussed, and or that I talked about in terms of the gradual changes, all of these shallow flow path that are here, where if you've got carbon, nitrogen, phosphorus, these are being activated, and those solutes are then being flushed into the rivers. So we have strong changes in water quality during these runoff events. And these are not, so we've done some studies on this, and these are not proportional to those long-term changes that we are seeing with high flows. They're completely different. And when you have these anoxic conditions, either on the land because of stagnant water on the land surface, or in rivers sometimes as well, this can release greenhouse gases and also result in metal mobilization. So basically, floods are in some ways hot moments of solute and sediment export. And again, there are different effects on water quality of floods. So nutrients often increase and carbon concentrations in rivers increase as well. But it's less clear, and typical sediments as well. But dissolved oxygen, the pattern is a bit less clear, and the same thing for metals and algal blooms. Not completely, different things can happen in different places. And last but not least, we've got fires. So basically, we've got a burning of the above ground biomass, but also below ground soils and rocks can be affected by that. We change the organic matter that's available in the landscape, and when it rains afterwards, we can erode a lot of this organic matter that's being created, and this means that wildfires can have a long-lasting effect on the landscape and thus also on the soil structure and the soil water pathways. Again, this just an overview of basically how this is being altered, how water quality is altered because of fires. But fires change the landscape structure. Okay, so quick summary. We have rapid and gradual changes of so we've got both rapid and we've also got gradual changes in water quality impacts based on changes in pathways and travel time. So it's not just the inputs that are changing, but it's actually the pathways of water that are changing. These are really, really hard to constrain because we have interactive effects and threshold effects. So it's never clear when a system will spiral out of control, basically, or when it will return back to the previous setting. So this kind of a system resilience is important here. It's not straightforward to disentangle these different effects, and it's also, these are not visible, as I showed before. They're not directly visible. It's not a color change from blue to green or blue to yellow. It's just a composition change, and that's often remains invisible and thus is often missed. We are not at a point yet where we can predict what is going to happen in different cases. We have an idea of what may happen, but we can't really pinpoint the mechanisms yet. And that means we don't really know what will happen, and that may actually be worse than the actual impacts. So what we need is, we need to, for example, have more data, particularly related to these extreme events. So, and we need to because we need this data to actually understand the mechanisms. And I know UKRI is very good at funding research that's based on impacts, but the one thing I always say is that we need to understand the mechanisms first. So that's not blue skies research, but it's trying to gain the knowledge about the processes that are actually happening and how these processes are being changed, because they are very, very hard to, they are slow processes often, and figuring these out is important so we know what will be happening to water quality. Then we need to develop some forecasting abilities. In terms of modeling, this is complex because often we train our data or we calibrate our models on current conditions, and climate change means things will be different. So it's very hard to actually do this. There are some approaches, and we suggest some in the paper that may be able to do this and are showing some promising results. But these need more data to be able to actually run. And with this, I want to finish and say thank you for listening, and yeah, I'm very happy to take questions.